Yeah, I think that's better.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is John Barnwell, and I'm here with Robert Allen Pittman, the noted martial arts instructor and master teacher of physical disciplines and longtime student of Rudolf Steiner's work, anthroposophy, spiritual science, as I am myself, as those of you that have been watching my episodes, my episodic journey through all these diverse conversations, that's really the core of my personal study, although it's included many other fields. And what's nice, we were just discussing it before we came on, but Robert and I were discussing, the engaging nature of the spontaneity in these conversations, because we really haven't ever spoken before other than this series of podcasts. So it's very interesting in that it has that bubbly spontaneity that's so refreshing. It really is a conversation. And so we managed to come up with the title to give us a launching point. And what's beautiful about it is we're not sure where it's going to go. And so that's a good thing. It's Rudolf Steiner and the Grail mysteries, and it's the fourth conversation we've had thus far. And in light of this, I wanted to kind of open with something that Rudolf Steiner himself said regarding the subject. And this is in one of his principal works, that's Collected Works, Volume 13. Originally published as Occult Science and Outline, it's now currently available as Esoteric Science and Outline. But in Chapter 6, the present and future evolution of the world and of mankind, as it was framed in the earlier edition, he says, and I quote, "We see then that the knowledge of the Grail culminates in the highest imaginable ideal of human evolution, the ideal of spiritualization brought about by man's own efforts. This is the ultimate outcome of the harmony achieved in the fifth and sixth epochs of our present age. The harmony between the powers of intelligence and feeling man has now acquired, and the true knowledge of the spiritual worlds. What man is thus achieving in his own inner life is destined ultimately to become an outer world. Great and sublime are the impressions he receives from his surrounding world. And in the aspiration of his mind and spirit, as he goes out to meet them, he at first divines and at last clearly recognizes spiritual beings of whom these impressions are the outer garments. His heart responds to the infinite majesty and sublimity of it all. Moreover, he begins to know that the experiences and achievements of his own inner life in intellect, in feeling, in character, and strength of purpose are seeds of a future spiritual world, a world in process of becoming," end quote. And so that gives you basically a summation of how Rudolf Steiner himself envisioned his 36 and a half feet of shelf space body of work, so that he in essence said that were the book Occult Science and Outline given another title, it would be the Grail. And so you see that what we have here is a continuation of something that extends back into the night of time, back into the ancient world. And so I have here in my guest somebody who, like myself, has a lifelong interest in trying to figure out what was going on over vast expanses of time. And so with these opening regards, let's say hello to Robert Allen Pittman. He's over there in Warrington, in Britain, holding court.
Yes, it's the north of England, which used to be Old Wales, but now is part of England proper. And I am at the home of archaeologist Mark Olly, who is also a fellow Grail researcher. So before I came up here to talk to you, John, I said to Mark, what is the great theme in all the Grail legends that you have studied? Because he spent about 30 years on them. And he said, well, for me, the great theme is this idea of what you're gathering around to do. And his idea was the idea of communion, and how this is a repeating theme throughout history and around the world. And even down to our last topic of King Arthur's Round Table, that people are going to circle and sit together and discuss something and come into a unified alignment of some kind. Steiner used the word constellate, or gather round and constellate. And I think it's important in our conversation to realize that although the Grail is the target, the gathering is a extremely significant part of the equation. And I'll leave that with you to blast off.
Well, that's an interesting clarification, because if you dig into some of the lectures of Rudolf Steiner, you'll see how he characterizes the differences between different epochs of time. And so if you go toward specifically our topic today, it's really interesting what he says regarding it, because he says, and this is in chapter 6 of the outline of Occult Science, he says, how did that reappear which had become submerged in ancient Egypt? It reappeared in such a way that it became visible in the holy vessel, which is spoken of as the Holy Grail. Guarded by the Knights of the Holy Grail, in the rise of the Holy Grail could be found that which had sunk down in ancient Egypt. And in this arising of the Holy Grail, there stands before us everything that went into the post-Christian renewal of the principle of the ancient mysteries. Fundamentally speaking, the phrase Holy Grail, with all that belongs to it, involves a reappearing of the essence of the Eastern mysteries. And so that's a very specific reference to the mysteries of ancient Egypt. And for those that are conversant in the works of Rudolf Steiner, we know that he spends a great deal of time dealing with the mysteries that were in other cultures in the Mesopotamian region, and so you're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh and his relationship to who the person he refers to as Eabani, or it's most often referred to by contemporary writers as Enkidu, the hairy wild man that wrestled with Gilgamesh. And so there's a great deal of wisdom to be gleaned in those studies, but that he points towards Egypt as being the source waters of the Grail stream itself in this reference. And in fact, I think I might have, that was in lecture 4 of the Mysteries of the East and of Christianity. And that's volume 144 in his collected edition. And that's an excellent series to become acquainted with if you have any interest in the Grail, because it's one lecture cycle that Rudolf Steiner emphasized by the way he contributed a forward to that, which he didn't normally do. And so if we're looking at this, and you're a student of Rudolf Steiner, it's a difficult question to live with. And regarding your question about the communion aspect of it is really what brings it together, because the Grail stream itself is described variously in many different sources, but Rudolf Steiner makes the point of that it's that which embodies the idea of the cosmic intelligence that is centered around that which is universally human. And so what would universally human mean? It would be implying that there's something that goes beyond anybody's family or tribe or nation or a folk soul group in general, that one is becoming truly a planetary citizen, so to speak, and that in that sense all men are brothers and sisters, and it's that the familial extension extends to all mankind. And he draws that distinction between ancient Egyptian architecture, where it's very much in the very private setting that one goes through an initiation with the high priest leading you through temple sleep and that whole experience. But yet what happened with the incarnation of Christ is that mystery of death and resurrection was taken to the next stage of development, in that it was brought out and performed out in the open to set a stage, plant a seed for the transformative impulse that the mystery of Golgotha implies. And so when you look at the architecture in the cathedrals that were supervised in their construction by the Knights Templar, Rudolf Steiner says that a cathedral is very different from the ancient mystery temples. For example, in Greece, the temples were dwellings of the gods that they created out of their relationship to contemplation of the spiritual world, residences, so to speak, for these beings to dwell, and that it wasn't even necessary for any human being to be present. I mean, it's really, I've never heard anybody else say something like that about Greek architecture. But yet when he, let me finish this, because yet when he gets to the Gothic, he says, Gothic cathedrals are not complete without all the people inside. So it literally is a communion, a coming together. And of course, the Mass itself is the Last Supper. It's the celebration of communion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the communion table in the old Greek temples often had a trap door that went down into a long cavern that led to somewhere else. And they would leave fruit on the table, and then the next day it would be gone. And there's speculation as to who was taking it where. So there was this idea that they were a place for something else to come and get something and leave again. And I think that's an interesting model. On the communion side, we were touching on ancient Egypt and the mysteries of the communion, and I just wanted to touch on the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Enkidu, who was the wild man, is also a form of the green man, as is Osiris in the Egyptian mysteries, who was cut into pieces and then reassembled. Both of those figures are co-resonant with this idea of life everlasting or life rebirthing. So this seems to be intimately connected to the symbolism of the wheat, which dies in the ground to be reborn, and is a sort of model of the psychological aspect of the spiritual life, where you end up giving up yourself to finally recognize what you really are. So there's some interesting long lines of reappearing symbolism throughout history pertaining to the green man, pertaining to life everlasting, and pertaining to communion. I was thinking of Melchizedek, who had bread and wine in his ritual, and then Christ himself said that he was of that order of this bread and wine, and that brings up some very interesting thematic principles. And one is fermentation, and the other is rebirth. And the fermentation aspect evolves through history into alchemy. And the rebirth aspect seems to basically form into psychology. And these are streams that come and reappear up and down like a fish's fin in and out of the water through history. And I think those are interesting themes in relation to this idea of communion. There's another aspect of communion which is interesting, and that's the round table, where people become co-equal because they sit in a circle rather than at a long table with a head chair. And that brings up all sorts of issues of the equality that people can and need to share in modern life that didn't exist in ancient life. And the idea that the hierarchical relations in society became progressively more and more representative, or hopefully so. And that theme, of course, gets hijacked quite a bit, as we have in present society. So there's all sorts of interweaving themes all within and around the Grail, which I think are interesting. And I wanted to at least plant the axis that there's the possibility there's more than one, and that we do have physical historical items with documentation that seem to confirm that they are a Grail or one of several Grails that were at the Last Supper. My friend Mark Olly talks about the last place setting, and his take on it was that after that gathering, that quite a few implements were taken because that meeting meant so much to everyone, that basically people took, you could say, souvenirs or mementos from that last dinner home with them. All of these things became sacred objects, and they account for legends worldwide about various Grails of various shapes and various objects that are given Grail meanings, including the cup in Valencia that actually has Arabic documentation that correctly dates it back to the time of Christ and within the lifespan of the disciples. So I wanted to throw some of those things in because although the Grail is an incredibly symbolic picture, it's also got a physical, tangible, historical reality and pedigree and some fascinating implications that have the Indiana Jones resonance, but the actual historical reality. So I'll throw that back at you, John, and you can wax on.
Yes, the Grail has been interpreted to mean many things. And in a conversation with the prominent anthroposophical Grail researcher, who was the mentor of one of my key mentors, Werner Gloss, and the Grail researcher Walter Johannes Stein, who wrote World History in the Light of the Holy Grail, the 9th century. And that there, in that book, are developed the subtext regarding events that happened in the 9th century that are actually considered by Rudolf Steiner to be the actual Grail events as portrayed imaginatively in all the numerous versions of the Grail literature. And so you have the key document, esoterically speaking, in a way, is Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal. And in that is the account of ultimately the development of consciousness, that it's an initiation document. And Rudolf Steiner refers to Wolfram von Eschenbach as an initiate, and Wolfram in this text connects the Grail to the Knights Templar, which of course came much later than the 9th century. So you have this interesting connection being made. And when one looks at that and sees how this leads back into the past, you have to go really to the works of the talks that were given by Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, the founder of biodynamic gardening, to find some of the references here. And he had the opportunity of having a close relationship. He was a part of that circle of young people around Rudolf Steiner, as was Walter Johannes Stein and a few others. And so he was able to ask Rudolf Steiner questions, often when nobody was around. Like, for example, he used to drive Rudolf Steiner oft times in a car, and they would have these wonderful conversations that he could ask him questions. And so we have statements from Ehrenfried Pfeiffer that are pointed directly at, although he didn't give references to it because it's not to be found in any of Rudolf Steiner's lectures, but he points to the reign of the Queen Hatshepsut of ancient Egypt. And she's considered to be one of the high points of ancient Egyptian culture in the New Kingdom. And she's very unique and the only female pharaoh. She actually formally took on the title of pharaoh, but Ehrenfried Pfeiffer makes the comment that all of the masters of wisdom and the harmonization of sensations and feelings were incarnated within the court of Queen Hatshepsut, and that her chief advisor, which is a gentleman named Senetmut or Senenmut, he was a commoner who rose to the highest station in the kingdom, and he was an incarnation of the individual that's referred to in the Grail sagas as Parsifal, that he had reincarnated. So you see that the seeds were planted for the Grail events way back, like in the 15th century BC. And so you have this kind of fulcrum of the ancient Egyptian impulse coming forward and leading up, reflecting the early beginning of the age of the consciousness soul of which we're currently in, which is unique. And if you look at the story of the 9th century, you see Rudolf Steiner describing that you're taking the impulses of the sentient soul that were the key impulses within the ancient Egyptian period for 2,160 years until 747 BC. And then it goes into the intellectual soul, the Greco-Roman period. And then in 1413, 1414, you have the beginning of our current consciousness soul period. But in looking at that, you see that Rudolf Steiner describes how, although it was coming out of these sentient soul impulses in imaginative workings and then coming toward the expression of the intellectual soul, which he also calls the higher feeling soul in one of the lectures, which is very interesting. And that what he is able to achieve in becoming Grail King is to actually manifest the future consciousness soul at that time in the 9th century. Configure the consciousness soul much before the consciousness soul period began. And Rudolf Steiner makes points about that there's templates, so to speak, that are created for the intellect, your being of mankind, by the deeds of these great initiates, that they accomplish something on the behalf of mankind, so that as we move into the future, there is something that's already been expressed that can give us a context in which to unfold these capacities within our own being. And it was Parseval who actually achieved that. And that's that initiate Senenmut, this Manu figure. It's very interesting because his tomb has a zodiacal ceiling, and it's the first zodiacal ceiling found in all the Egyptian tombs, and it was actually copied by Seti I, another notable pharaoh of the New Kingdom later on. And so you have this whole idea of bringing in a new emphasis on the mysteries of the stars as representations in imaginative expression, which is very much like the zodiac in the Knights of the Round Table that you referred to, and often expressed in the architecture of the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. So you have this idea of the inward mysteries of the Grail and the outward mysteries of the Knights of the Round Table, that they're a cosmic mystery of the expression of the Christ being as being the regent of all forces of nature. And likewise, you have this inwardness of the Eastern Grail mysteries and how they come together in the 9th century and are woven together through the deeds of Parseval.
There's a copy of one of those starry Egyptian ceilings, not a copy, but they have a reconstructed tomb in the Louvre demonstrating the zodiac on the ceiling, and it was brought from Egypt. So I did get to walk under that and look at it. And it reminded me of this idea that they were well aware of how tiny a human being was in comparison to the cosmos, that they realized this huge vaulted starry sky had some kind of meaning for a very tiny creature on the planet. And you had mentioned 8th and 9th century, and while Wolfram was writing his stuff, Avicenna was in Bukhara, Afghanistan, saying something else in his commentaries around this time. He was around 900. And he had a very simple question for his mystical Islam compadres. And his question was, if you were floating in space and there was no gravity and no pressure, would you feel like you existed? And this was a very profound question, because what he was asking was, do you experience yourself because things are pressing on you? Or do you experience yourself because you have a self that radiates outward from a core, like from your heart? How do you experience yourself? As something that is imposed upon by space and by the stars and by the planets and by the air and the trees, by the animals, by people looking at you? Or are you a creature that experiences something bursting out from the heart, radiant, like a flame or a light, shedding things like light and awareness all around you, like a lighthouse? So he brought this up. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because this question of how you feel life, whether you're radiating or introspecting, was the question that was beginning to appear in the minds of students of mysticism and philosophy around the world, while the Grail mysteries were being brought forward. And I think it's really important that we see that was a simultaneous activity. This question of how do I experience life?
Yes, absolutely. And you can look around the world and you can see the inklings of what you're talking about, because you go around the 9th and 10th century and examine the developments in various cultures, and you'll see that there's a development coming out of what Rudolf Steiner had said, because he said in the 9th century that Michael, who's the regent of cosmic intelligence, that the cosmic intelligence was brought to Earth, and that it was to develop out of mankind. And so that's a very profound statement. If you're any of a student of Rudolf Steiner's work, that's like highly significant. And so when you look and Avicenna or Ibn Sina, the great medical and cosmological figure in the Arab world, is very significant. You can also go into India, and then you find that there's many of the principal developments within the tradition of Advaita or non-dual Vedanta were happening at that time also. So you have this tremendous development of the content of the philosophical and yogic and spiritual dimensions of the Hindu tradition developing around that same time. And also in Kashmir, with the developments of the Kashmiri Shaivism with Abhinavagupta and Gaudapada, and it's all centering around that time. And so you see that it wasn't just something that just left no expression in the world, that this development of cosmic intelligence being able to be taken up by the intellectual soul, but yet he clearly states that it's Parsifal that takes it a stage beyond that, in preparation for the current age in which we're living. So I thought it would behoove us to kind of explore what the implications of that are. Because if you look at the consciousness soul age that we're in, one thing you could say about the consciousness soul is it's somewhat of an antisocial creature in essence, but yet it's meant to be transformed into the spiritual soul. And it's through that communion element that you're referring to that this comes about. So it has to do with the transformation of wisdom into wisdom love. And so it centers around the Grail question that Parsifal failed to ask at first. When he sees the wounded Grail King, when he comes to the Grail Castle, he doesn't ask him, because he was told not to be overly talkative, and he's given all these instructions about what to do. And so he doesn't ask, brother, what ails you? And so because of that, he ends up being catapulted basically into his journey through the wasteland, and that he is faced with the desolation and the benighting of consciousness as a result, only to overcome that through overcoming doubt or tumfight and resolving it into salda or blessedness.
Yes, there's also, I think, a very fascinating relationship between communion and confession, because when people eat together, they begin to talk. And if you want to loosen the group up, you just bring some good food in and some wine, and they warm up and they start talking to one another and often confide. And you'll find total strangers confiding in one another the way they would never confide in with an intimate friend. And so the power to me of the communion is that it brings out confession. There's a little bit of in vino veritas, and there's a tricky bit there where, of course, if they drink enough, they may say how they really feel without meaning to. But there's a deeper meaning than that, and that is, in the atmosphere of comfort and trust, If the table is truly circular, then people will confide how they feel, and then it becomes what I would describe as a kind of confessional, not in the Roman Catholic sense of there's an authority figure with whom you enter a box, but in the sense of when you have a friend, as Buddha said you must have, you can discover things about yourself through genuine conversation you cannot discover any other way. And so in the presence of another, granted the level of honesty, we become ourself. And I think that aspect of communion operates tandem with confession. So the element of friendship is a sort of overlapping principle around the Grail. And of course, it also has to do with our entering into contact with the divine in a direct sense. And I'll let you go from there.
Yes. The basic message of the Grail that's pointed at by Rudolf Steiner is that you bring somebody with you, that it's something that you can't truly achieve on your own. And so it implies that communion, again, that you're referring to. And in getting into all the various objects, like there's a question that was asked here on the side about the relationship. Do you and Robert know anything about the connection of emeralds to the Grail? Well, that points to one of the attributions. Mind you, in Wolfram von Eschenbach, he variously describes the Grail as a thing and as a stone, and in other stories it's described as a cup or a dish, and so there's all these various descriptions. But in getting into that whole idea of that story has to do with Albrecht von Scharfenberg's description, where he says that the Grail was fashioned from the stone that fell from the crown of Lucifer, and it's oftentimes interpreted as being an emerald. And so you have this idea of the emerald, and emerald being a green stone, which ties into what you were saying before, because if you get into Islamic mysticism and say Ibn Arabi and authors like that, you'll see that they make reference to something called the Green Kutub. And the Green Kutub has to do with the sacred presence of the heart. And it's green because if you get into understanding the system of chakras as a rainbow, right in the center of the rainbow is the color green. Likewise, right in the center chakra, the 12-petaled lotus, the zodiacal chakra, is the color green. And of course, its counter image is magenta, which is like a kind of a peach blossom color that's Rudolf Steiner refers to as being a base color of the pure human soul. And so there's this mystery of color, and you can go further into the mysticism of the Sufis and all of that. And they make reference to a being they called Qadir. And Qadir is the green man. And he's said to, just appear in certain circumstances. And it's like this master being that shows up. And it's often described as a manifestation of John the Baptist. So there's a lot going on there with the color green and the green man and the Cernunnos of the cauldron of the Celts. And so green is a very significant color when it comes to understanding the mysteries of the Grail.
And I'll say green is also the outpouring of copper, because copper always releases a green precipitation. So when you're studying the green man mysteries or the green mysteries in general, you end up back in the Copper Age when they were mining copper And I have a little copper stone here. Let's see, there it is. And you can see that although the stone is iron, it has a green, it has little green particulates on it. Okay. And that's the copper. And so when you find this in the wild, this is what it looks like. And this is, this stone is from Alderley Edge, where some believe Arthur is buried. And this is from the burial mounds on the top, because it's a series of copper mines as well as burial mines. And it's been used to mine copper for, at least a couple of thousand years. So when we study the Green Man and we go back, we can study the copper mining and the copper trade and the meaning of value, because copper was valued and it was used as jewelry and it was used in medicine. And of course, the old Brits painted their bodies with it. They would get the green precipitate and paint their faces and bodies, as the Romans found out. Sometimes they would paint with cobalt as well, because cobalt exists alongside copper. So they would have the colors blue and green smeared on their bodies in battle. And when the Romans first saw them come out of the caves with their bodies painted blue and green, they thought they were demons. So this green theme goes back a long way, and it's very Celtic. It's very ancient, and you can do a lot of tracking all the way back to the Copper Age with it. Mark Olly did a book on the Green Man with an extensive research summary about the Copper Age and what it meant, and how it affected various cultures. So the Green Man pops up through that. The green theme pops up through that quite a bit. You had mentioned in Islam, when they talk about Khidr or Khizr, who is the Green Man, or the ever verdant living one, who is the tutor of Moses in Islam. And he is also considered the tutor of those who have never had any formal initiations. So in Islam, there's a classification for people who are initiated by nature. So they have no lineage, they have no formal teacher, but somehow through their own latent qualities, they become knowing, and they become progressively enlightened through contact with nature. And I think the word is uwasi or uarsi, but these are considered students also of the Green Man. And I think it's important to have that as a classification, because not all come through the intellectual window. Some people come through the intuitive window and the natural window, and they have fantastic insights and instincts. And so these would be the students of the Green Man, which one anthroposophist described to me as the etheric body of Christ, incidentally, which I thought was interesting. And the woman who described this to me was a light therapist who worked with glass that was impregnated with mineral substances. And of course, they had a green glass. And these glasses would be put up, they were about the size of a door. And people would sit in front of them in a chair and be bathed in a colored light. But they were very specifically designed for therapy with specific minerals impregnated in the glass. And she had this incredible sheet of emerald green glass. And I saw that. She sent me a slide of it. I said, that reminds me of an encounter I had with the Green Man. And she said, oh, yes. She said, I think that green is directly related to the etheric body of Christ. And that's something I would like to follow up on in reference to your targeting the heart as having affiliations with the color green. In tradition, there is no green chakra, but what's interesting is that there is a blue one. And so we're back to this idea of blue and green having some kind of cousinship because of cobalt and copper. So I'll throw that out. And then among the Naqshbandi, there is a principle in meditation. If you go into the darkness behind your forehead and you look for light patterns, you look for the color green. And I can tell you it's a lot easier if you did your sun meditation that morning, because you'll usually find something quite bright in your head due to the pineal gland. But that color does change. And some traditions say it changes according to the angels you're operating with that particular day. So I'll throw those tidbits out and let you roll on, John.
Well, you could take it to another level of examination, because if you take the metal gold, for example, and if you hammer it into very, very thin foil and you shine a light through it, the light will come through green. So that you could say that the occult or hidden color of gold is green, which is almost counterintuitive. I mean, you say, well, why would it be green? You know, but yet it's the case. It's just like another optic thing that you can do with motor oil. If you shine a light on it, it's green, but if you shine a light from behind and shine the light through it, it's a reddish magenta color. So it's showing that idea that is parallel with the after image. For example, if you were to draw a circle that was magenta and stare at it, and then stare on a white wall or piece of paper, then what's going to happen is you're going to get the reversal, so that from staring at magenta, you'll get green. Or if you stare at green, you'll get magenta. And those kinds are called in esoteric tradition flashing colors, but that it's something that's used in a lot of Hermetic societies as a means of meditation. And Rudolf Steiner, of course, does very extensive studies in the attributes of color and colored light and the difference between colored light and pigmentation. I used to have one of the spectrochrometry units that was made by the Zarathustrian theosophist Gedalia Dinshaw. The thing was huge. I mean, it was like this big appliance, that was very ornate, and it had all these sliding gels that, like what you're talking about, that the colors developed from metal oxides. And I had some amazing results using that on certain things. And so, yeah, there is this spectrochrometry encyclopedia I used to have.
Yes. Yeah.
The big 3-volume set, and stuck on the inside cover is a warning from the Trade Commission not to take it across the state line, and all. They really came down on him, because he was showing that he could cure things, and he wasn't using any drugs or anything. He would work with the tattvas, which are like the elements, and they go through cycles during the course of the day, and you can determine that by just showing the steam, the shape that's made by the steam steam that results from putting a mirror under your nose. You could see that there's an expression of the tattvas, or the elements. And so this is the way, we're dealing with realities here, and it's more than just a curiosity. It's truly is a quest, because the more you connect it, and like what the work you're doing in trying to get into the mythic content of indigenous cultures and see what can be found there, that it's all over the world, but it's like this mosaic, and different cultures have different pieces. And so you can assemble these, and that's much of what I did in my first book, especially, but also even further in my second book, is to show the universally human aspect of the mysteries. And in looking at that, for example, many people that study Sufism, all that, they don't even know, because it's not really widely known. But there's was just as you have the 12 tribes of Israel, you also have the 12 Arabic tribes. So that these cosmic understandings are present all over the place.
Yes, there was two commentators. Sorovardi was one of the great commentators on color and light and angels, and the other was Najam Cobra. And both of these men had classifications of prophets, colors, internal organs, spiritual states. And they were all coming in, interestingly, John, around your 800, 900, 1100, basically pre and mid Templar period. All these great thinkers in Islam about color and breath and phenomenology and ways of assessing one's level of development. This poured across the globe within a 200 to 300 year period and affected all religions worldwide. And shamanism, it was like a new approach to spirituality. And in our time, what's happened recently is the doctor named Doidge, Doidge, I think. He's released a book called How the Brain Heals Itself. And he's talking about their use of simple, non-harmful blue and red lasers on the back of the head of people who've had concussions and getting remarkable healing in traumatic brain tissue and traumatic brain injuries, just using light on the back of the head repetitiously and thoroughly. So there's a tremendous relationship between colored light and the human brain, which is very light sensitive, as well as the whole human body, which is semi-transparent anyway, as any child who's played with a flashlight knows. On the emerald thing, I wanted to remind some folk that there's a long tradition of gemstones and healing therapy for the simple reason the body is made of minerals, and we carry minerals in our body. Therefore, there's a kinship with minerals outside the body, and emeralds have always figured in as one of the great healing stones. And generally, traditions classify stone by star color. Mars is red, for instance, or planetary color, and also by organ assignment. So Mars would be will, it appears red in the sky, it would go with the heart in some traditions. These things vary from culture to culture. What I'm getting at is the attempt of human beings to align themselves with their environment through color and find a level of congruency, how to order themselves or how to see themselves becoming aligned on the inner and the outer. And the whole gemstone thing, even up into the new age stuff, putting crystals on the body and that kind of thing, that comes all the way up into our modern era. But it actually, there you go, it actually has a very, very long pedigree going way, way, way back. And there we are in Egypt and probably Atlantis before that with what stones can do. I remember when I was 8, my brother was 10 and he built a crystal radio. And I watched him build it. And I didn't realize that a quartz crystal, if it was wired at each end, it could be used to pick up radio frequencies. And so that made an impression on me as a child. And a lot of things have capacities we're unaware of until they're put in a certain context. And I'll let you go from there, John.
Well, if we just take the rainbow itself and you look at it from the viewpoint of spiritual science, you could take the sequence of the 7 fundamental colors, and that what that leaves us with is the 4th color in the rainbow is green. And likewise, in the scheme of evolution that is presented by Rudolf Steiner, that we are in the 4th world, as the Hopi elders would say, that the Earth existence, our human realm existence, has to do with the 4th world, which is the mystery of birth and death. And so it's interesting that the mystery of birth and death, and yet Kadir is he's the ever living one,
Right.
So he is one of those beings that's transcended that mystery of birth and death. And so in looking at that, it's a whole series of questions, and that's the wholesome way one can approach it. That the Grail mystery itself is something that as Rudolf Steiner had said to Walter Stein, he said, well, you could look at Grail as gradualis, which means gradually. And so it's this whole idea that there's this gradual unfolding of a process, really. And it reminds me of conversation that's in the Conversations with Eckermann, the secretary of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, that he recounted. And it's interesting because this one gentleman, I kept wanting to see Goethe and talk to him about his scientific work. And Goethe was a member of over 100 scientific societies and a leading figure and in many areas of life. But so he came over to Goethe's home, and Eckermann let him in, and he brings him into a room, and Goethe's sitting around a table, just like with your communion thing. And in the center of the table is this big rock, and they're all sitting around the table, and they each all have a bottle of wine and a glass, and they're sitting there looking at this rock. And the guy, there's an open chair, he sits down, pours some wine, and then sits there with the rest of them, and nobody said anything. And he sat there for half an hour to an hour. Nobody said anything. And then after the time had gone by, Goethe stood up, thanked everybody for coming, and left the room. He never said a word. They just sat there, sipped on their wine, and contemplated this rock sitting in the center of the table. So if that isn't a communion, I don't know what is. And it kind of ties it all together with the mineral and the wine. And it's interesting because the wine tends to kind of relax the blood vessels and stimulate the warmth, a little warmth in thinking. But that's the draught of forgetfulness, and that the mysteries of Dionysius was the introduction of wine. And what that did is it made mankind more earthly. It pulled them away from their clairvoyant experience of reality and led to ultimately the development in the 6th century BC of philosophy. So that we had to come from the garden, but we're going to the New Jerusalem, and they're not the same thing.
No, can't go back.
Yeah,
Can't go back. The wine is interesting because of the whole process of fermentation, and it is, of course, a poison. Now, our body makes alcohol, but when we drink it, we, of course, you could say we just add more to the fire. So what wine does with the vasodilation and the what the medievals called false warmth, because you find out it's just like flash heat. It's like the heat you get from eating refined sugar. It's gratifying but brief. You need something with a little lasting power. But wine gives you that temporary comfort. And it, in some ways, because of that, at a certain quantity, it will raise your awareness. I remember one teacher telling me that the way he was taught to drink in communion was to drink about 6 ounces. And he said the whole congregation would basically drink a half to 2/3 of a glass of wine. And they would drink it all at the same time, and then they'd put the glass down. Then the minister would lead the prayer. And the idea was to take them to the pre-buzz state, not the buzz state, but the pre-buzz, when the attention is very high but still present. And then enter prayer at that point. And I had never heard that because I was used to the ceremonial thing with little tiny cups where you couldn't quite taste enough wine to satisfy yourself. But I thought that was an interesting model of actually using alcohol to bring the congregation into a single unified state of concentration. And I had never heard it used deliberately like that before. So I think that's a thought-provoking idea. And go ahead, John.
Yeah, that's interesting because it kind of gets everybody on the same page, so to speak, as
Yeah,
far as a mood of soul. But that being said, just as our Lord transformed the water into wine, Rudolf Steiner does make the point that now we've entered into a period of time to where we should transform the wine into water. And that's that the wine played a very important role in the evolution of mankind, but it's something that's of the past, and that it's something that should be left behind if one's attempting to foster their spiritual and soul development, that it can impede that process by creating a substitute ego, so to speak.
yeah. This is something and gives reason for both Islam and Buddhism to dislike alcohol because it tends to forfeit mind, and they're very big on mind, much to the Episcopalian dislike. It's still an issue that we need to be conscious of what's happening, and so alcohol can break through. Speak of the devil, make us less conscious instead of more conscious. So you're fooling with a very fickle dotted line there. I razzed an anthroposophist I know who has a vineyard when I told them, well, Steiner said alcohol and wine was pure poison. And they said, well, yes, I know. So I didn't push it. Didn't push it. And yes, I still have a glass of wine now and again. So
yeah, everybody has to make their own decisions regarding
sure.
behavior. But
Yeah.
that being said, if you look, for example, at the ancient Greek use of wine, the amphora, and they had these large tankards that they would mix the wine with water. They didn't drink it straight.
Right.
And most people don't know that. They think,
Yes. To this day, the Sicilians will always add water to their wine.
yeah.
And there was also a way of storing grape juice under sand in clay pots that were sealed so that it would not ferment. And a lot of people don't know that there were certain traditions where the wine did not turn. So we could go into this whole thing of the alchemy of fermentation and distillation and effects on the soul, spirit, and body, and renegade Baptists and all the rest.
Well, perhaps we should do an episode on the mysteries of Dionysius.
I'll drink to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, what do they say? An old friend of mine, he said, well, the Catholics, they got the booze and the Baptists got the women.
yeah, what is it? The Baptists say they allow, what was it? They don't, well, I better not say that. We're in a public forum. Anyway, yeah, Baptists are really strict. But the alcohol thing is a very interesting equation. And because it's related to distillation and fermentation, it's also got a close cousin in the manufacture of perfumes, which also has a very ancient pedigree and relates to smells, colors, planets, and therapies and psychologies. And that's another spin on what's in the wine, is the sun, planets, and all that stuff. And we could discuss that a little more. I did want to say one thing before we break up, and that's that we've sort of talked about the theme of the Grail, what's around it, the metaphysics of it, what it can mean, what it could mean in the future. But I think it's also very important to say that there are physical, historical grails, probably at least 3, with definite paths and documentation in history that all come from the Holy Land and may have been on the same table. And Robert Kelder's done quite a bit on the Grail pathways through Europe. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's done the lion's share of work tracing the resting points of the Grail as it came through Europe. And the only one I can recall offhand is the one in Valencia, in the cathedral, and it's on display. And it does have the Arabic paperwork from the Crusades. And it's missing a piece because I think Saladin broke a piece off to keep for himself. So I want to keep the physical, tangible, historical aspect present with all of our metaphysical meanderings and quilted ambrosia. Thank you very little. Yeah.
Yeah, there is that. And Rudolf Steiner does make very specific reference to journeys that were involved with the Grail. And one place that Ernford Pfeiffer makes reference to is a church that's south of the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain. And Rudolf Steiner makes reference to, you have to cross this kind of rough terrain and go into Spain, and that there was a place where for a time the Grail was kept, and that's San Juan de la Pina.
Okay. Is that in Zaragoza or Catalan? Do you know?
I'd have to check it. I don't have that stored in my brain
it's interesting because a lot of
ether body, really.
A lot of the land on that side of the Pyrenees was disputed because the Templars did not have documentation, but apparently there was secret pacts, especially in Aragon in Spain. And there is one book on the Templars in Spain. I've forgotten the author's name, but he talks about how mysterious the tracking the ownership of the properties of that area. Because of the Templar involvement, they deliberately obfuscated documentation because most of the properties were held by agreement, not by documentation. So there's a lot of Templar mysteries in Spain as a result of that. And as you know, they rebranded themselves as the Order of St. John and the Order of Santiago, and continued the Templar mission after the Templars had been inquisitioned in France. They got rebranded in Spain, and in England they submerged and rebranded themselves as well. So that's another question of what happened to the Templars.
Yeah, it also leads into the Knights of Christ in Portugal, and there's a great deal of terror when you start approaching the Grail mysteries. There's no shortage of directions you can go.
And one thing I wanted to mention too, John, was after King Arthur finished his battles, there was a point at which he had all the resources. He was considered the champion of the region here in the north. And it was only when all that was concluded and he had all of his resources at hand that the Grail stories begin. And it was as though he wanted to lead in peace as well as in war. And the way the sequence takes place, it's interesting because it looks to me like he felt like he had earned his right to be king through war, but he wanted to have some sort of spiritual impact. And so the Grail commissions began during this period of peace after all this incredible battle regionally all around the north here. And the Grail tasks then began.
Well, Rudolf Steiner he really makes no bones. He says that the Knights of King Arthur points to the activities of a expression of the great lodge of mankind, and that it was the Christianizing on a level of cultural, as a cultural impulse, because it was pre-Christian in that it's coming out of their own cultural milieu, and that they didn't have a relationship to the historic Christ until later, but that they had already been experiencing that presence of the Christ as the king of the elements, and that it was this whole expression in nature that was this overcoming the dragons and the monsters, and all of that is indicative of the overcoming of the challenges that would meet the sentient soul. And that's that whole idea of struggling against the unredeemed astrality that is an expression of that lower astral impulse.
Yeah. The passions.
Yeah.
The passions.
Well, we could just go on and on and on here, but I don't want to keep them too long. I know it's dinner time over there, and
true.
And,
time for my communion
in Wales, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, in the north. Just call it the north. Yeah.
But we have our links below. You could buy us a cup of coffee if you appreciate what we're trying to do here, and that's on eBay, of course. And here's my first book is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And that has a foreword by my best buddy, Douglas Gabriel from American Intelligence Media. And my second volume is The Arcana of Light on the Path. And in both are the series of diagrams that I gleaned from Aaron Pfeiffer, but I added a great many more that lays out the cosmology of Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science in detail. Currently, the first volume, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, is out of print and reprinting, and I have to get to that. But this one's still available right now, The Arcana of Light on the Path. You can get it on eBay in the continental US, or you can contact me through my academia link below or through private message on Facebook, and I can get copies to you. I want to put thanks out for people that have supported me, especially Tyler and Douglas Gabriel and Vadim and Vivian and Jesus, so many others are included in that. And it's just great to be able to continue on doing something that I truly love. But that being said, I want to thank you all for showing up here, and I really want to thank Robert Allen Pittman for his wisdom. And you could check out his books on martial arts if you're inclined in that direction, and there's a link below for those.
Oh, also, John, I've got Mark's book here for them to see.
Oh, good, yeah.
It's just come out. And it's the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur. And it's a complete archaeological breakdown of the earliest Arthur legends, and they are in sequence and footnoted. And so it's the first time the legends have been shown in their historic continuity. And Mark is very careful about which legends were added later and which were part of the original story. So you'll get a look at the exact axis of the story with footnotes, as Mark would say, at the end of the book where they belong. So he has a nice presentation, very clear, and it's going to cause a little bit of a kerfluffle in historical corridors, but it's precise and accurate. And if you're interested in the historical Iron Age Arthur and his relationship to the world and to Joseph of Arimathea and to Merlin, there was actually several Merlins. This is definitely a fantastic study. John Matthews said he wished this book were available when he began his Arthurian studies because it would have saved him an awful lot of time. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks, John.
I'll make a point of putting a link to that book later on so that it'll make it easier for people to look it up. And thank him on my behalf for writing the book in the first place. I wish I'd have had it too. It would have made my job a lot easier in writing my first book. That's some 640 pages of deep diving into these subjects. And so now you perhaps people can understand why I've considered this a lifelong quest.
Oh,
There's
yes.
literally the volume of material that's needed. I mean, just to deal with the Egyptian and Babylonian thing, I had to compile this bibliography, and so it's about, for me, leaving no stone unturned. But keep in mind that the real key is the way you bear it in your heart, and that you may be intimidated by some of the knowledge, wisdom, information, however you want to describe it, that we're sharing here, but that you keep in mind the actual transformative force that we're referring to has to do with, if you could develop and foster your relationship to Christ while you're awake, then he will be there for you in the world of sleep and dream, and that you can come into a relationship with these things along the lines of what Rudolf Steiner has indicated. And a good way of guiding oneself in that direction is the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, and that it's all encapsulated in there. Whether you understand it or not doesn't matter. It's still transformative. And Rudolf Steiner is very clear. He says it could be translated into any language. He says, of course, it tend to be more potent in certain sacerdotal languages, like the original Aramaic or in Latin or Greek. But that being said, I just wanted to leave that with you because you don't want to feel left out. You could be working on that on a daily basis and consecrating your food when you're at a meal with others, especially. That brings in the communion. And so that being said, I want to thank you all very much for coming with us on this journey with Robert Allen Pittman.
Thanks, John.